There's virtually no expansion of service area. There is no opportunity to succeed when a plan is implemented that is proven beyond a reasonable doubt to harm the service to the passengers, reduce investment in service infrastructure by the companies, and force drivers to work longer hours for less money. Administrative time and costs increase significantly to deal with the influx of new drivers and consumer complaints. Now, what is new with deregulation since the late 70s and 80s? Since the deregulation failures of the late 70s and 80s, only two relatively large cities have experimented with taxi cab deregulation. In '94, both Cincinnati and Indianapolis deregulated their cab industries. I guess they thought that because a decade had passed since the last taxi cab deregulation failure, that they would try again. Oh, that's understandable. Even though times had changed, the fundamentals of the taxicab industry had not, and the results were no different. Taxicab drivers have become labeled taxicab companies, but regardless of what you call them, they struggle to survive, and the cities incrementally keep adding regulatory requirements to bring the industry back to where it started, which is fully regulated. I can honestly say that nationally, the major debate over taxicab deregulation is over. Yes, the issue arises, and some cities may still implement it from time to time, but we know what the outcome will be, and we know that over the long term, the cities will re-regulate. We as an industry, excuse me, that has always been in favor of regulation, and me personally as well, have always been opposed to over-regulation. What has been and what is the recommended future course for taxicab regulations? Most important than discussing, or more important than discussing the failure of taxicab deregulation is the discussion of what constitutes the most effective current taxicab regulation. Items that need to be addressed for the full community to have taxicab service that meets the travel needs excuse me, of the public in a safe, comfortable, timely, and cost-effective way would include: 1, safety, insurance requirements, regulatory enforcement, vehicle inspections, and age limits, required automatic dispatch systems. Taxicab fares, uniform fare, taxi meters, fare review. Quantity of taxicabs and taxicab companies. Limits on the number of taxicabs. Limits on the number of taxicab companies. Quality of service, fleet branding, driver standards, company service standards, quality assurance, minimum fleet size. Now I'm going to go into, I'd ask you to be kind enough to indulge me for a few minutes and allow me to speak about the industry in my hometown, New York City, and how trends in New York City have appeared and are appearing all over the country. In New York, we have, and I just got done explaining to you a little before, an industry that's diversified. New York City is unlike any other city, as I explained before, in the United States with regard to the for-hire ground transportation industry. In New York City, yellow cabs are not permitted to receive dispatch calls. That's today, and are relegated to doing only street hails. The rest of the for-hire industry in New York City, black cars, limousines, liveries, airport shuttles, paratransit, and non-emergency medical transportation providers respond to prearranged calls only and are not permitted to do street hails. This condition appears nowhere else in the country. What I've outlined in the first part of this segment of my speech, in addition to showing you the differences between New York City and the rest of the United States in the for-hire ground transportation industry, in brief, is to show you the diversification of the industry and how it has trended. Back in 1971, the New York City Council enacted Local Law 12, which established the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission to govern the industry, even though it did not have any regulations for limousines, only for taxicabs. Looking back, we see that for the most part, only taxicabs were being regulated and only taxicabs were being licensed. And that is not only in New York City, but throughout the rest of the country as well. Given the fact that only taxicabs are being regulated in some municipalities, being restricted to the amount of vehicles licensed to operate, and therefore the only means of for-hire ground transportation, the industry looked at other methods of for-hire ground transportation to transport passengers and provide service to the riding public, hence the beginning of an enormous trend. The industry subsequently branched out to begin transporting passengers in varying types of for-hire vehicles, and therefore the rise in diverse means of transportation. For example, limousines, black cars, liveries, shuttles, paratransit, and non-emergency medical transportation providers. The trend which evolved from the above was the full-service for-hire ground transportation company. Company owners saw the need to expand their service to include other modes of transportation so as to accommodate the riding general public and corporate clients alike. Another major trend in our industry here in the United States has been the movement away from voice communication to the more efficient, technologically advanced data communication. In New York City, this trend was fostered and warranted by the corporate community, which saw the need for faster and more efficient communication between the client and the dispatch center, and between the driver and the dispatch center. This trend is a very fluid trend, changing as the technology changes and becomes more advanced. Another trend we are seeing here in the United States is the movement to more regulation, where there hasn't been regulation before, and tighter regulation where there currently is regulation. In summing up my comments, I'd point out that throughout history, trends occur in different and varying situations and conditions, and for many different reasons. Our industry, being subject to a regulatory environment and changing economic conditions, acts almost like a chameleon. We adjust to times, conditions, and situations. In today's environment, our industry here in the United States is adjusting to the current economic condition, the enhanced regulatory environment, the changing technological environment, and the ever-changing competitive environment. Addressing the competitive environment, I'd like to enlighten you on the fact that given what I have outlined above regarding New York City, one sees that different segments of the same industry can function to the benefit of the riding public. In conclusion, there are a variety of factors such as costs, technological advances, and changes in service demands that require taxicab regulations be periodically fine-tuned. Regulatory adjustments to taxicab fares are routine, but when one examines changes to the number of taxicabs, safety requirements, driver standards, and our company standards, everyone becomes more concerned that there will be winners and losers. Quality service requires investment. As long as the existing companies are willing and able to make that investment, and the passengers pay a reasonable fare, and the drivers make a reasonable living, then the community, the riding public, the regulators, and the industry as a whole are the winners. Thank you for allowing me to come here and ramble on a little bit.
Thank you, Victor. We have 5 minutes for questions, for Australia, as well as for Victor and his visit to Australia and his presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Hanif Patni. I live in Ottawa and run several taxi fleets in Ontario. Blair, a question for you. I can't believe it's 20 years since I lived in Australia and used to know the industry intimately down there for a few years, and actually stole many of your wonderful ideas to bring them up to North America. You talked a lot about how advanced your industry is in the idea of how a customer gets into a cab. And many of our North American companies here at the upper end tend to match what you do. Many don't, but we are keeping up to the Australians on that front. Where the Australians have really shone over the last 20 years or so is that when I was there, 22 taxi companies were all participating together in a single private label card under the cab charge title, where a customer could go from taxi company to taxi company, city to city, and pay with that card. And I believe that you also took credit cards and debit cards, charging the same surcharges. Could you enlighten us on the more recent history? Because I understand that that arrangement is being challenged. I understand that there are new parties that are competing against that arrangement, and that it's under a bit of pressure. If you could enlighten us, I'd really appreciate it.
A bit of background for everybody. Australia's been accepting credit cards through a company called Cab Charge for probably 20 odd years, and or 25 years. Cab Charge started off as a group of taxi companies working out that being able to accept credit cards would make it safer for drivers and also increase ridership and be a great boon for customers. Now, in introducing that facility, you need to be able to make it pay. And so Cab Charge, when it introduced the ability to accept credit cards, also added a service charge or a convenience fee, and they put it at 10%. Which seems like a very large number for most people, because you typically talk about merchant service fees of 1 or 2% for Visa and MasterCard, maybe 3 or 4 for American Express. But the option was always given there for the customer as to whether they wanted to pay by credit card or not, and if they didn't want to pay the 10%, then they paid by cash. 50% of transactions occur by credit card, so the market made the decision that they were going to accept that convenience fee of 10%. And it's been going for decades now. More recently, we've seen a number of competitors come in. Not only did Cab Charge put in place the ability to accept credit facilities, but it also put its own card out there. And the interesting thing about a Cab Charge card was that there were not a lot of restrictions on who could get one, but it could only be used for cab fares, and became tremendously attractive for government officials who wanted to provide their officers with an ability to catch cabs, but didn't want to give them the ability to go down to Sears or Macy's and rack up an enormous amount of dollars for their government department. So Cab Charge produced their own card acceptance facility, and that replaced a whole host of the voucher systems that were unique to individual companies, and so that became a card that could be used nationwide. But you could also transact business with a cab through Visa or Amex or any of those card companies, card facilities. Interestingly enough, it's really only been in the last say 4 or 5 years, I suppose, that there have been competitors coming into Cab Charge, into that market. They probably collectively now have about 25% of the market. Our competition laws effectively mean that anybody that wants to come in and compete with Cab Charge can do so, but it's a difficult area. And I probably can't say too much because we have a regulator of these things down in Australia called the Australian Competition Commission, and they're currently investigating Cab Charge.
Blair, given the diverse population densities in Australia, how do you effectively measure the response times in a smaller area that's very few people with very large, or very few cabs in a very large area, in comparison with an urban environment?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Effectively, response times are basically, because you're using computer dispatch systems, and you're using computer dispatch systems even in country towns down to sort of 10 or 11 cabs. Effectively, the response time is when the call came in, it's logged by the computer. Cab arrives at the customer. When the meter goes on, bang, sends a message back to the dispatch system, and that 10-minute response time is calculated from when the call was taken to when the meter was either flashed on that the cab arrived, and that occurs all the way down to the small cab companies. Obviously, for those folk who are sort of running 1 or 2 cab towns, it becomes difficult to measure.
Thank you. Thank you, Blair and Victor. And we welcome you back in the afternoon to join the debate team. Thank you.